Welcome, everyone, to this wonderfully windy Friday that we have with us. So today, this afternoon, I'm very glad and happy to present Daniel Gascon. He is an associate professor in the Sociology and Criminology Department at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And in 2024, he had the prestigious fellowship at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center right here at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He has published in scholarly journals such as Critical Sociology, Race and Justice, Social Justice, and Social Problems. Yeah, I read that wrong. Okay.
You got it right.
Daniel is the lead author of the 2019 book, The Limits of Community Policing, from New York University Press, and lead editor of the 2024 book, Police and State Crime in the Americas, from Palgrave Macmillan Publishing. His current research and teaching interests include police and policing, juvenile delinquency, civil and human rights, Marx and Marxism, Latina, Latino, Latinx studies, Black studies, and urban ethnography. Help me to welcome with some applause, Daniel Gascon.
I feel like I have to come through a doorway. That's the official start. Thank you, Whitney and Adam and everyone here at UMass Amherst and at the Du Bois Center for welcoming me. It was a real pleasure to come and learn here and work with you all, get to know Du Bois and his legacy a little more. I think that was a really important, crucial, instrumental part of the project, and it's something I'll talk about a little bit more later. I also have to thank my collaborators and research assistants in the Racial Justice Laboratory at UMass Boston. Without their commitment and their belief in the work that we do, it wouldn't be possible. I also would like to thank my colleagues in the Racial Democracy and Criminal Justice Network, who have been huge supporters of my work from the very beginning, and some of whom have also graciously agreed to read and review this paper when it comes out. And I'd also like to thank my wife for her support and effort in helping me prepare and taking today off to come help and support me. All right. This administration, his attacks resemble a 100-year-old hatred, targeting civil rights as DEI initiatives, sanctioning white nationalist violence, and pardoning convicted murderers in blue uniforms. During the lifetime of Dr. W.B. Du Bois, he saw this hatred rise and fall and had a direct hand in it. This study seeks to recover a lesser-known part of his legacy, to highlight the resonances with contemporary Black and Marxist criminology, and reconstruct a theory of policing along the color line that traces the contours of the global racial and colonial capitalist system. I'm sure that Dr. Du Bois can give us not only the strength, but also the strategies and the hope necessary to change things going forward. I'd like to give you all a break from that last slide. Emotionally, I know. I'd like to start by noting a little bit about my process of recovering this legacy. So first off, this is a case study that combines archival and oral historical methods. And it's one in which my analysis will involve an iterative process, going back and forth. It has going back and forth between the development of research questions and building theory and building and collecting data. So that's been my general approach. It's one that's very common to qualitative research, and it's one that I can speak more to if folks have questions later. I set about tracing Dr. Du Bois's thought and life by building from here at the Du Bois Papers and working with the staff and the archivists at the center and in the SCUA upstairs, as well as with my students and faculty colleagues. I got to say that coming here was an instrumental part of the learning process of learning Dr. Du Bois's work, because I still feel like I'm learning it all. I'm trying to take it all in and make sense of it. But I think working with you all here got me to think about and talk about Du Bois in a very particular way. I think I appreciated him for all his accomplishments, what he did, who he was, but I think it really wasn't until I got here and started to hear more about him and his family and things behind the scenes, and to think of him as like a grandfather, an older family member, someone that you can at once love, but then also hold accountable, right? I really appreciated growing that kind of awareness of him because I think it helped me to better understand his work. So in the course of doing this study, I collected several of Du Bois's most notable works, some of which are pictured here. Some of the things that aren't pictured are over 300 artifacts, including newspaper articles, clippings from newspapers here and all around the world, artworks, drawings, CIA and FBI surveillance files, letters, pamphlets, court case opinions, and much more. Many of these artifacts are single pages or leaflets, but some of the lengthiest, including a UN report, are well over 300 pages, so I'm still analyzing the data. I'm going to study 3 periods of Du Bois's life. He published over 80 years, so what I did was divide that period evenly, and it roughly equated to about 26-year periods. And it's not perfect, but it kind of also fits somewhat neatly with some key turning points in his life. This part is still kind of in development, so any suggestions that anyone has there would be much appreciated. I'm going to touch briefly on the first period, partly because this is what sociologists know of Du Bois the best. His early works, his thoughts on the color line, his thoughts on Black subjectivity, that tends to be the bulk of what sociologists know and study about Du Bois. His later works tend to be a little bit too political, non-sociological, but from the very beginning, I assumed that they're sociological. So just so you have a little context about what was happening between 1883 and 1963, Du Bois witnessed a whole host of changes at the social, political, and economic levels in our society. He saw the rise of the robber barons and reformers after the New Deal. He saw the World War years, as well as the Korean War. He also saw a number of significant advancements and innovations in the history of policing. He saw the dissolution of slave patrols and the rise of night watchmen, the formation of professional police forces, but then also the emergence of the secret police. And in terms of the history of Black civil rights and the Black freedom struggle, he saw the formation of mutual aid groups and legal advocacy organizations, as well as the development of militancy and insurgent tactics that developed into the 1960s. And some of these are images that I'm pulling from Boston's history. This is sort of looking at some of the works that are some of the incidents that happened were in that city, but then also some more notable ones in Chicago in 1919 in the Red Summer. All right. So what we know now about Du Bois's work is that the current moment that we live in, like previous moments in the past, is defined by and confined by race and racism. Part of how he wants us to understand is by making his readers and his followers look through his eyes, look through the eyes of someone who's subjected and marginalized within this system. He wants to show you how bound those movements are for a person who is subject to racism and segregation and discrimination. This is what he reveals to be the color line. Much of his work is centered around revealing that to his readers. Much of his life's work is spent trying to undo it. So if you're a Du Boisian sociologist, like I increasingly see myself as, you are someone who is engaged with and concerned about public interests, taking a critical perspective, and making sure that you consider the global implications. There are some more recent notable Black and Marxist criminologists that I think he's in constant conversation with. One of the people that is very seldom mentioned in conversation with Du Bois, but I think who should be more often, is Stuart Hall. He covers a very similar terrain in a very different way. Right? He gives us this notion of articulation, right? An idea within a capitalist system about how power forms and takes shape and how it extends and reaches into society and makes material changes, has material influences. He talks about this process in his book, Policing the Crisis, in which in the 1970s in London, you had the moment where the mugger crisis was created. There was also an element where you had an emergence, a creation of a new dangerous class. Right? These are some key ideas that Hall helps us understand, gives us to help us understand relationships within racial and capitalist society. There are some other thinkers, though, like Angela Davis and Stephen Box, whose work looks at the international connections of criminal justice regimes and the extent to which police crimes are sanctioned by legal systems and facilitated by the networks and the structures around them. Hall also helps us understand how, from the subaltern perspective, from the perspective of the person that's subject to all of this power in society, there comes a point when they are moved to resist, to disarticulate structures of power. And there are some key thinkers that give us this notion of structural punishment, finding ways to hold whole states and whole criminal institutions accountable. So some of these kinds of ideas are useful, I think, in helping to give some shape to a conversation in Du Bois's work that even he doesn't highlight as central. Oops. So the basic idea, and this is why it's just such a couple of concentric circles, the basic idea here that I want to draw out is that Du Bois is aware increasingly over time of multiple levels of analysis. In his early work, he's concerned with police articulations, policing structures, police brutality at a local level, in Fisk, in Philadelphia. And he's also interested in understanding resistance and self-defense at that local level. Later in life, when he starts to get a glimpse of the United States from this vantage point as an editor of The Crisis, he has a much fuller picture nationally of how these two opposing forces are at work and linked to the local level. And then lastly, as an older person working more squarely abroad in movements abroad, he connects that to international movements. So this is kind of the overall sketch of what I'm trying to say. I don't know if that's exactly what I'm going to end up with at the end, but this is the idea in development. So here I want to try and compose a theory of Du Boisian police and community relations. All right. So in this early period, Du Bois, I can just point to the walls around us. That's all awesome. In this early period, Du Bois is receiving his PhD at Harvard. He takes an early position at Wilberforce as a faculty member, and where he marries, and eventually moves to UPenn as a faculty member and writes The Philadelphia Negro, moves to Atlanta, has and then loses his son Burkhart, and witnesses one of the most horrific racial massacres in US record. After which he writes The Souls of Black Folk. When you read between the lines of the work that Du Bois is writing at this time, you find that he characterizes the moment of post-Reconstruction as dangerous. He writes that young Blacks had few formal resources, and the invisible hands of Jim Crow were beginning to restrict Black social life. He reflects on and laments in Souls for his former primary school students who at this time lived like caged birds, though the law said they were free. He wrote, "Ill could they be content, born without and beyond the world, and their weak wings beat against the barriers of caste, of youth, of life, at last in dangerous moments against everything that opposed even a whim." On one of his trips back to Tennessee, Dr. Du Bois learned just how easily these birds could be taken up into the long arms of the law. "They told Jim to run away," he wrote. But he would not run, and the constable came that afternoon. It grieved Josie, and awkward John walked 9 miles every day to see his little brother through the bars of Lebanon jail. By the time he arrived in Philadelphia at the turn of the 20th century, Du Bois observed firsthand the role of the white policeman in the Black urban world of Philadelphia's 7th Ward. He wrote, "We lived there a year in midst of an atmosphere of dirt, drunkenness, poverty, and crime. Murder sat on our doorsteps, police were our government, and philanthropy dropped in with periodic advice. Policemen in this society policed the boundaries between white and Black. They corralled white immorality with all walks of Black life, and as a result, crime and disorder and immorality ran rampant, aided, abetted, or ignored by what Du Bois would call an inefficient white policeman. This policeman enacted legalized discrimination, and one of the prominent patterns that he observed was wrongful arrest and conviction to some degree. When he interviewed Black people in the 7th Ward who had encountered the police in the legal system, many of them charged the system with employing racial prejudice. Dr. Du Bois reflected that police inefficiency contributed to crime in the 7th Ward and undermined the legal system's legitimacy there. This was the bulk of what he spoke of in terms of the structure of policing at the local level at this time, and he only wrote of police shootings, for instance, such kinds of violence twice. At this time, though, he's optimistic about the promise of science. He thinks that by taking the facts and the realities of the existence behind the veil and the color line and revealing that to his readership will somehow help undo that hatred. And he believes in this time in the existence of a talented 10th, right? A segment of the Black population that would become educated, middle class, and eventually one day lead Blacks, the entire group of Blacks, out of bondage. But his program for Black freedom continued to evolve over this course. He observed, though, that Black policemen, and indeed other Black professionals, were on average more efficient than what someone would have expected for Black people only 30 years outside of abolition. He wrote, "The colored policemen as a class are declared by their superiors to be capable, neat, and efficient." But as organized anti-Black violence increased at the turn of the 20th century, young Du Bois began endorsing forcible Black resistance. In 1904, Du Bois penned a World Today column entitled "The Parting of Ways," in which he attacked the Tuskegee approach to Black advancement, saying, "We refuse to kiss the hands that smite us," and instead urged that only revolutionary violence and suicide would earn the Black masses equal rights in the future. He says, "The way for the Black men today is to make these rights the heritage of their children, is to struggle for them unceasingly, and if they fail, die trying." At this period in his life, Du Bois witnesses, as I mentioned earlier, the massacre in Atlanta. And this is one of the pivotal moments in his life that propels him to organize. He takes part in the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and becomes their director of information, where he becomes the editor of Crisis Magazine. He attends conferences and congresses abroad, which I'll come back to, and publishes Dark Water. For some reason, or partially as a result of the things that he says in that book, he leaves the NAACP and goes to Atlanta for a second time, where he completes and publishes Black Reconstruction and goes on a world tour. It's at this time that he's really beginning to grasp the realities, the contours of the racial and colonial capitalist system, how historically it breeds on and feeds on exploitation, and it carries out its duties and maintains power structures by violence, and how it's a system that extends not only outside of the South, but around the world. Within this capitalist system exists the racial state, in which democracy is significantly limited, where there is a legal apparatus and a media apparatus that is controlled by the white industrialists. From this vantage point, as an editor of the Crisis, Du Bois could more easily see the contours of the gigantic beast of brutality, police brutality, and its interlocking forms of state-sanctioned violence. He says, They mobilized all the machinery of modern oppression: taxes, city ordinances, licenses, state laws, municipal regulations, wholesale police arrests, and of course, the peculiarly Southern method of the mob and the lyncher. In the latter pages of the crisis, there usually appears this section titled Along the Color Line, as you can see here, in which Du Bois offers his own views on the national picture of segregation at a glance, where he reflects on the role of the police and how they engage in the restriction of public space, housing, and even love and marriage. The federal government at this time fails to check or control local police powers. What was then emerging was a new set of tools that propelled the racial capitalist machine. Each new segregative ordinance or vagrancy law emboldened the white mob's will to lynch. Du Bois explained, while all instruments of group control, police, courts, government appropriations, and the like were in the hands of whites, no power was left in the Negro hands. If a white man is assaulted by a white man or a Negro, the police are at hand. If a Negro is assaulted by a white man, the police are more apt to arrest the victim than the aggressor. If he's assaulted by a Negro, he's in most cases without redress or protection, and the group will of the colored man has no power to express itself. This moment, you see unprecedented levels of white lawlessness, extreme cruelty and viciousness, and all of this works to overthrow the gains of Reconstruction. And there are two cases during this period, both that occurred in 1917, that are particularly illustrative of what happened at this time: the railroading and lynching of El Persons and the massacre of Black Valley. Railroading and bulldozing were two terms that Du Bois and his reporters in the crisis used to refer to the corruption between police and the courts that led to the wrongful arrest and the wrongful conviction of scores of Black men. There was one case that shows just how consequential that initial act of railroading can be. For instance, there was a young white woman named Antoinette Rapal in Tennessee whose body was found, and a Black laborer named El Persons, who was working nearby where her body was found, was ultimately accused. Part of the evidence that police used was that they took photographs of the victim, and one detective claimed that after looking into the victim's retina, could see the image of El Persons emblazoned on their eye. This is at a time when police investigations are still becoming a thing, but still, fantastical. A couple of other ideas that emerge through close reading of the crisis is the notion of the third degree. This is like torture tactics that police would apply to elicit a confession from suspects. Well, they applied these to El Persons, but he would not confess. So police falsified even more evidence to convince a judge to convict him. Another concept to come about in the crisis was this notion of the usual murder. The sheer frequency with which comments about murder with no context whatsoever appeared was unnerving, just based on their brevity. For instance, there was a section in Along the Color Line where Du Bois would kind of talk about different topics, and one of them was crime. And typically in those sections, it would read something like, a large number of murders by policemen and white men have occurred during this month, period. Pages of the crisis including reports of police involvement in at least 81 lynchings from 1910 to 1926. Lynchings were often sparked by Black men injuring or killing night watchmen, deputies, and other police officials in confrontations. But in the case of El Persons, a bloodthirsty mob of 5,000 people seized him from a quote-unquote willing sheriff's posse, and the entire town closed the establishments to join in the debauchery. And the police were on hand to maintain order at the execution site, where mob leaders brought the man forward, hands in chains, and they burned him alive. There were other moments of large mass-scale violence in this period, and another case that took place in 1970 that I mentioned a moment ago. I call it a massacre here, even though that term is kind of used interchangeably with others in the text. But I use it purposefully. Because to me, when people talk about race riots, it's confusing. You don't know whether you're talking about urban riots of the 1960s or you're talking about massacres of this period, which the origins and the process is all very different. So for that reason, I choose the term massacre. At this period, massacres served to prevent race mixing, miscegenation, to defend racial purity, to punish Black crime and supposed insolence, to maintain white neighborhoods and vengeance against irresponsible politicians. But there were also times in which Black laborers posed a threat to white men and their economic prosperity. Dr. Du Bois reflected on the horrors, for instance, of the 1917 massacre of East St. Louis, Black Valley neighborhood, in his book, Dark Water. So hell flamed in East St. Louis. The Negroes fought. They grappled with the mob like beasts at bay. They drove them back from the thickest cluster of their homes and piled the white dead on the street. But the cunning mob caught the Black men between the factories and their homes, where they knew they were armed only with their dinner pails. Firemen, policemen, and militiamen stood with hanging hands or even joined eagerly with the mob. In the wake of the violence, the federal government formed a congressional committee, and they found that a group of white joyriders had sparked the whole situation. Black resistors then took up arms in self-defense, and police and militiamen joined the melee, and it spilled over out from there. What resulted was that you saw large-scale violence, Black people being indiscriminately attacked. As you could see here in an attack of a train car. Homes were burned, buildings were burned, and again, police, sheriffs, and watchmen were all ineffective in controlling this violence. Either they kept out of sight when the mobs formed, or they witnessed and were willingly sanctioned the acts by failing to intervene, or they arrived too late to capture the white assailants, or they were unable to identify white suspects in subsequent investigations. In one case, a young Black housekeeper was named Mineola McGee at 24 years old, was standing on the front stoop outside the home of the woman for whom she worked. She had just arrived there for the day when the massacre broke out. At this time, a policeman and a soldier hailed her from the sidewalk, and as she turned, the soldier fired upon her, hitting her in the arm. After she received medical attention, she woke up in the hospital to find that her arm had been amputated because she had no insurance and her entire family had been killed in the massacre. Throughout this period, it wasn't just that police were indiscriminate in their support for white mobs. There were definitely a handful of instances in the study where policemen risked themselves to defend Black life and interests, but that was by far fewer than the other cases. Over time, Du Bois's appeals, in this period, Du Bois relies most heavily on engaging in an act of public education, right? Through the crisis, he's trying to sort of build a Black consciousness and use this not propaganda for the sake of propaganda for the sake of changing hearts and minds of whole groups, right? And the NAACP is organizing anti-lynching marches. They're holding the federal government and local municipalities accountable. They're working with policy leaders to prevent harmful films from being shown, like the Birth of a Nation, and in general, trying to change policy at a local and national level. But over time, Du Bois begins to grow frustrated with the lack of progress or the speed with which the changes are being made. And in a crisis editorial in 1933, Dr. Du Bois explained, "I believe in peace. I shudder at revolution. But when in 1906, the Atlanta mob began killing Negroes wholesale, I went and bought a repeating shotgun and loaded it with buckshot, and I have got it yet." In a crisis editorial some months later, titled "Mob Tactics," he explained how accusation, lynching, looting, police collusion, and white impunity are all institutionalized forms of oppression. And he says the only solution to this kind of problem is not only to permit, but to encourage Negroes to keep and use arms in defense against lynchers and mobs. There were some instances during this period, also as this one during 1917, in which Du Bois sympathized with Black violence. In this case, police were chasing a crap shooter, and they went into the backyard and eventually into the home of a Black woman named Mrs. Travers. She was a single mother, had 5 kids. Police falsely accused her of being involved in the craps game and ultimately beat and arrested her. A crowd of Black people formed in the street as police were arresting this woman, and in the crowd was a young man named Private Edwards, who was one of the soldiers that had recently arrived to the new Camp Logan. Camp Logan was a recently installed training installation for the Army that was now being populated by the famed Buffalo Soldiers. They had come from battlefields all over the world. They had been deployed to battlefields in the Southwest because this is a time when the conquest is happening in that part of the country, and then now they're in Texas. So a couple of these soldiers engage in or try and reprimand the police and try and gain information about the status of Private Edwards and another officer who became embroiled in conflict with them. And ultimately, the entirety of Camp Logan, 156 Buffalo soldiers, screamed onto the police station in which they engaged in street skirmishes with white men and police in the downtown area of Houston. Prior to that, Houston had been seen as largely peaceable. These Buffalo soldiers were part of the largest increase or largest influx of the Black population locally. So the white population there didn't really appreciate the change. And they were all martyred in the wake of the attacks. The police officers who were involved in the violence fared much better, and Du Bois denounced the treatment in an editorial entitled 13, where he says, "Above all, we raised our clenched hands against the hundreds of thousands of white murderers, rapists, and scoundrels who have oppressed, killed, ruined, robbed, and debased their Black fellow men and women, and yet today walk scot-free, unwhipped of justice, uncondemned by millions of their fellow white citizens, and unrebuked by the President of the United States." In practice, Dr. Du Bois favors legal advocacy and institutional reform over militancy. And then throughout this period, he also, again, makes reference to this notion of the talented 10th, always calling attention to Black excellence in civil service and in police enforcement. Toward the end in the last period of Du Bois's life, Dr. Du Bois is now writing at a much quicker pace for some reason, even though this is the last period. For reals, he writes Dusk of Dawn. He goes back to the NAACP. He starts and helps to create the UN. He writes The World, or Color and Democracy, The World in Africa, takes part in editing and writing the We Charge Genocide Report, joins the Peace Information Center, and writes In Battle for Peace, reflecting upon being charged as an unregistered federal or foreign agent by the federal government. He joins the Communist Party, moves to Ghana, and dies at 95. In this period, he's still writing about police and the conditions of Blacks in the United States. He says they are most often falsely accused and innocent, while at the same time suffering the most from disorder, crime, and violence. While he had very few personal entanglements with police and the courts, he sees them as instruments of cruel oppression of Negroes and poor whites. In this period, he starts to examine, again, more broadly, the U.S.'s involvement in machinations around the world. Police actions of not only the U.S., but other Western powers, such as the U.K., France, Spain, or Belgium, and those police actions that take place not only within their national borders, but extend across them. In Dusk of Dawn, he reflects on the harsh reality of the white policeman in the Black American world. No one who does not know can realize what tyranny a low-grade white policeman can exercise in a colored neighborhood, he says. This is also an interesting time because he's beginning to reflect on some changes in the nature of democracy in the United States. He says, you know when you've crossed into a police state because the government is involved in trying to control your thinking. The government is controlled of the propaganda that you see on a daily basis. There is an unfolding of a secret police. There are spies all around you, and the entire society lives in fear. If the hairs on the back of your neck are not standing up, you're not listening. At this time, he becomes the object of suspicion. The FBI and the CIA start surveilling him as he's traveling abroad. They go to his hotels before he's there to set up shop. They take record of his speeches and at one point even take his passport away. He's charged, along with 11 other members of the Peace Information Center, for being an unregistered foreign agent of the Soviet Union because he's working for peace abroad. And one of his collaborators in the Peace Information Center, John Rogie, becomes the prime witness against him. He has enough support and enough wits to mount a very successful defense. The trial is quick. The FBI brings in publicly available information and not much evidence apart from John Rogie, who ultimately admits on the stand that he invited Du Bois into the organization to begin with. And so the case is dismissed. But he still worries about all of the unprotected masses, because even though he had support and the ability, many, many others don't. At this time, he's also writing about police and US military-backed actions all over the world, strike-breaking and massacres among them, right? Including one here in South Africa, not perpetrated by the US government, but again, by another US superpower, the British government, or another superpower, the British government, who killed 72 protesters at a peaceful protest for labor rights in South Africa. During this period of his life, Du Bois, even though he's really squarely beginning to think, let me start over. He's really committed at this point to Pan-Africanism. Beginning in the 1920s, that's when he really gets introduced to the notion. He attends conferences and congresses in London and Germany, and he starts to become involved in movements abroad in this way. But in this period is when he's fully committed to it. And he's fully committed to the notion that anti-colonialism is the only way out. And he's also committed to the notion that there should be some ability to build connections, solidarity, not only throughout Black Americans, not only throughout the African diaspora, but throughout the dark world. And more, you start to see his involvement with regions around the world, including Latin America. And the more and more I see these pictures of the Panama Canal and the conversations that are happening now, it just gives me even more chills. But one of the more important ideas to come from this moment is his stressing that we need a sense of organized global protection for the dark world. And so he is involved in writing this report for the UN, in which he indicts the US government for allowing and supporting genocide of the Black population, particularly through police. In the introduction, they quote, "Once the classic method of lynching was the rope, now it's the policeman's bullet. To many an American, the police are the government, certainly its most visible representative. We submit the evidence suggests that the killing of Negroes has become police policy in the United States, and that police policy is the most practical expression of government policy." Ultimately, the appeal is unsuccessful. In my quick examination of this case, it's unclear whether he really wanted it to pass, because some people say that they thought it was like a political ploy, or maybe it would bring public shame. But again, it was ultimately unsuccessful, and the case was actually never taken in to the International Criminal Court. So after analyzing this material closely, what I find, again, is that at all these different levels, the national, the local, and the international level, you see a deep connection between the unfolding of race problems and the solutions that Du Bois thought. They're all organized human actions, from the criminal actor to the whole criminal organization to the criminal state, all in the service of racism. I think articulation theory helps us better understand this and its connections to the current moment, this history that Du Bois is bringing up. Because when we think about internal police actions, we can look around. We don't have to look too far to see them. There's a long-standing tradition of Black and Latino mass criminalization that in this moment is likely to get worse. All indications are that white racial violence against these and other immigrant groups will rise again. Mass internal detentions and deportations to private and foreign prisons will rise. Disinformation through Doge and the tech broligarchy and Trump's legal witch hunts against critics in the media and persecutions of academics will rise. There will be a war of propaganda over what is truth. There are also external police actions happening now that we should be aware of, that I think Du Bois would draw our attention to, such as the facilitation of international war crimes, including the Israeli war of occupation over Palestinian territories. Threats to claim the Gaza Strip for the US are included in that aggression. But I think Du Bois would also draw our attention to the wealth of methods of disarticulation that are out there now, things that we can get involved in on a day-to-day basis. Know your rights seminars when ICE comes to the door, for instance. Having a generation of journalists and scholars who should stay on the message, because we are the voice of the people. We are the ones that should be prepared to be persecuted, but truth, whatever it turns out to be, is going to be on our side. From Sanders and Warren to the Squad, public officials have to lead the charge, and through them, a new generation of Democratic governors will arise. In the meantime, there are international solidarities we should build, and the International Court is an institution that needs our support. Through all this, I'm further inspired by something that Dr. Du Bois said long ago. There is in this world no such force as the force of a person determined to rise. The human soul cannot be permanently chained. So where do I hope to go with all this? It was in the course of collecting all this data and talking to Phil, of course, because he's gonna provoke new ideas. That I learned of and wanted to learn more about the W.B. Du Bois Clubs of America. Right? There's this very short-lived student group that was actually propped up by the Communist Party, and that only lasted 6 years, in the year of Du Bois's death until 1969, which is very interesting because that's around the same time that we know that it was like the height of the COINTEL program. And in the evidence that I've seen, they use the same tactics against this group. So I would like to do some oral historical interviews with the former founder and leader, and see what other materials I can collect. That's all I have for you, folks. Thank you very much.
So I do want to warn you, at 6:30, there will be a large bell ringing, because we close at 7. But don't be, it's not the comic gift. If there are any questions, we're open to questions and feedback.
What comforts me, as I'm older than probably everyone in this room, and I don't know if Du Bois talks about, we are more spread apart. When I grew up, there was Harlem in New York City. There were just different areas that people were kept in the city. So we don't have as much anymore, and if people are spread all over the country, it gives me hope that we can conquer
That they can
some
talk
things
to other
that,
people. I don't know. I hope so.
yes.
This particular term I want clarified. I'm not quite sure I was able to hear it, but it was something about talent or like
The talented 10th.
talented tent or
10th.
tenth. Thank you. What does the 10th part refer to?
He had this notion that there would be a small segment of the Black population that would be allowed to achieve like middle class status, that would get well trained and well educated, and that this group would lead to freedom, lead the rest of the group to freedom. It's interesting, there's another concept that people don't really talk about that he also mentions in the Philadelphia Negro. He talks about the flip side, the submerged 10th. About how there's a 10% of the population who commits most crime. That's the organized criminal society.
So it's 10% of the
Of
population.
either, yeah.
Right. And then later on, when he's a little more radical, he dismisses it because he rolls it back a little bit because a part of becoming the middle class is to reach back and pull up. But when the middle class got where they were like, we're good.
Right.
So that it didn't quite translate. But the submerged tent, yes, that's, no one ever talks.
No one talks about that. He's closer studied.
Oh boy, there's a book.
A couple of things. One is that you're mic'd up, but the audience isn't, so perhaps you could repeat, maybe in brief, the questions for those watching online.
Oh, sure.
When they're asked.
I should brief the questions before they're.
Yeah, exactly. You can ask for it. I have some from the aforementioned Phil.
Okay.
Send them in advance of your talk. If you Phil Sinitier is a scholar in residence at the Du Bois Center. These are Sherpa in the archives as an intellectual.
Sure.
The human computer.
He's behind so much of what we do. He has two questions for you, Danny. One, what was your most interesting archival discovery?
Okay.
And the second question is, can you comment on the importance of sociologists conducting archival research as a qualitative practice of data collection?
The first one, I think.
What's the question again?
The first question was, what was the most interesting artifact I came across? I think it was in here. It's actually that photo of Du Bois being arrested. It was just, I guess I didn't expect it. I didn't know that corner of Du Bois' history. But when I saw that, to me, it made a lot of things click. It was kind of like a missing piece of the puzzle. So I don't know, that helped to generate a lot. I think the significance of sociologists doing archival research is that it's only now becoming popular again. Whether you trace the origins of sociology to the Atlanta or Chicago school, both of them involve rooting research, social research in the archives and then extending into the field. And that's the same approach I've tried to take here. I don't know how much claim I can make to that yet without having done my own original oral historical interviews, but the data collection process has involved me being very thoughtful and reflective about how I come upon leads, how I learn of new leads, and then also sort of learning about him from people, right? Again, learning his language, learning how to feel towards him. Those are all things about the data collection process that would not normally be talked about in sociological research. Ethnographers would talk about it, but historians wouldn't. Right? So I think that's the significance.
In case anyone's in any doubt, we route it to the Atlanta school here.
Yeah.
Sociology began at a historically black college.
That's right.
Atlanta University. Yes, thank you.
There was a quote at the end that you said. I was wondering if you could repeat it and where that was found in that book.
Can you repeat the question?
The quote at the very end. The quote at the very end, I believe, was Darkwater. And it was, "There is in this world no such force as the force of a person determined to rise. The human soul cannot be permanently chained."
Worth noting too that Darkwater, because it was published in the 1920s in the public domain, worth grabbing a PDF now when you can. Ripping it out, maybe.
That's right. Wow. Oh. Oh my, thanks.
Yeah, we have-
Sorry, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Repeat that. Like,
Get a free copy of Darkwater.
While you
PDF
can.
it, PDF it while you can.
If you need one, come through. Maybe it's better to come in person. Don't email.
Yeah, Tony.
Don't
I guess I know you had mentioned the shortness of his remarks on police in the beginning and sort of how you're collecting this data to kind of make the story. And I guess if you thought of any reasons why it had been kind of splotchy in terms of him writing about police explicitly at times.
Because he's not really focused on it. Like he writes. Oh, the question was what
Like why not? Why not?
why didn't Du
Yeah.
Bois talk about it squarely?
Yeah.
Um,
Or why do you think, besides being busy with other stuff?
Oh yeah, he was busy with so much stuff. I mean, I think it was just one of the many problems that he focused on, and I think part of his whole approach was to kind of bring to light the experience of racism and to show how restricted your movements are within it. Policing was just one of the hands that was, that manipulating your movements. So he kind of factors it into different stories at different times. But it's really when you kind of thread it all together throughout the course of his work that you see a more consistent story.
I guess follow-up is, do you think that if he were alive now, if his focus would be more on surveillance state police violence, considering how much, I guess, well, from my perspective, how much more fear people have of, in lack of, I mean, there are Black Lives Matter, but people, it doesn't, to me from reading, because I wasn't around in the 60s, doesn't feel as robust as it was before, with people, being in community to be out and to do so in a very consistent way. I don't know, maybe, but also I'm just kind of, I don't know if that was it.
I think if he was alive today, he would connect the phenomenon of police violence to the larger racial and colonial capitalist system. I think he would argue that this is just like evidence that this system relies on violence, constant violence. And part of what keeps it going is the blindness that many of us have about that connection. And it's not just what's happening here. The fight that we're having here is the same one that's being held everywhere else. The same people the same structures are doing it. That's part of what I feel like he resonates with Angela Davis on, right? I feel like he would agree with her that, there is a prison industrial complex, right? There is an economic incentive for the government to have certain people in chains. And again, it's not just here, it's happening all over, right? You can look at Trump and Guantanamo and his relationship with El Salvador and the prison system now to see that thing is still going on. So I think he would see all that as connected. Mm-hmm.
It looks like we're at a good time
Before the alarm goes off.
before we're closing to kind of just thank you all for coming. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. He has the mic. I'm not. Thank you for your questions, and we hope to see you at another Du Bois Center lecture. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.